Everyone to our fourth and final R3 presentation of this semester, but we have already some great stuff lined up for January. What we're going to do today is a little bit different. We'll do our land acknowledgement a little bit later in the presentation as part of the presentation. And what we'll do to get started right now, though, is just to, as we always do, introduce ourselves. So I'll start. I am Toby Park-Gagan, the Associate Chair of the Department and a faculty member in Ed Policy Evaluation. And we'll go around the room this way.
I'm Alex. I'm a second year PhD student in the EVE program.
And I'm a first year PhD student in
I'm Christine Moker. I'm a faculty member in higher education.
Stephanie Zolkowski, I'm a faculty member in ELP.
Stacey Rutledge, faculty member at ELP.
I'm Bunbu Mustafa, second year PhD in IME.
Brett Stoutwillett, I'm an assistant professor in instructional systems and learning technology.
Eric Ludwig, director of the online ADD and faculty in ELP.
Hi everybody, Cameron Beatty, faculty in higher education.
Aisha Khurshid, faculty member in ELP.
Hi, Madhukar Kida, department chair.
Hi, I'm Derek. I'm a first year in the higher education PhD program.
Hi, Laura Vaughn, first year PhD.
Great. And if anybody in our Zoom audience would like to introduce themselves, go right ahead, or if you'd like to do so in chat, Alex can read them out for us.
Yeah, so we have Cassie Keppel is a third year PhD in higher ed. We have Christian Skillings, a first year PhD in IME, and Holly Henning, a first year PhD in higher ed.
And if anybody else wants to through chat or unmute yourself, you're welcome to.
Hi, everybody. It's Sally, faculty in the LDR Studies program.
In the chat, so Kate Shell, second year PhD in IME, and Amog Basavaraj, second year PhD in IME.
Great. Well, again, welcome everyone. I am going to go ahead and turn things over to our newest faculty member, who we are pleased to have us present with us here this afternoon, Alounso Gilzene.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. As Toby just said, my name is Alounso Gilzene, and I am a new assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. So today, I'm going to do a presentation, but I really want this to be more of a conversation eventually at some point. So there's going to be some parts where I ask for your participation. But what we're talking about today is the art of storytelling, how narrative approaches can support the research process. And this presentation and this idea is sort of me trying to dip my toe into something that was very different from what I did in my dissertation, but supported the work that was done in my dissertation and things like that. So yeah, we'll just go ahead and jump right in. I can get this clicker to work. Also, I should mention that throughout the course of the presentation, you're going to see a number of murals. I just really love murals. Some of them are pictures I've taken myself. Some of them are things that I found online from different cities that I've been to. There we go. Okay, but before we get started, I did want to start with our land acknowledgement. So we within the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Florida State University acknowledge that our university is located on the indigenous lands of the Appalachee, Muskogee, Miccosukee, and Seminole Tribe of Florida. We highlight and pay respect to that history because we understand how the state of Florida and Florida State University came to be settled on these lands. We recognize this land as scarred with a painful past of enslavement, settler colonial violence, the desolation of culture, and the forced removal of indigenous bodies. Despite this, we respect the cultural and ceremonial practices these indigenous nations maintain in and around Tallahassee today. As educators, we honor the knowledge of these tribes and their people and acknowledge that indigenous students, faculty, and administrators are vital to Florida State University. We embrace the decolonization of our educational system and commit to disrupting suppressive systems through the explorations of many truths and lived experiences and creating room for those who are often excluded by harmful colonial erasures in our practice and pedagogy. Before we get started with getting into the material, there is a group activity, right? So if you have a laptop, if you're at home, please pull up a Word document or have sheets of paper at the front that you can grab if you have a pen and you can write with it. But I wanted you to answer this prompt or just think about this prompt, right? Even if you have like a cell phone and you have your notes down, right? Reflect on some of the reasons why you decided to pursue either graduate education or research as a career And I want you to write a story recounting one educational experience that helped drive your decision. And I know it may feel a little antithetical to start a presentation with silence, but I do think it's important to kind of set how we're going to be moving forward for everyone to kind of take a pause, reflect, and write out a story. And we'll give like 11 or 12-ish minutes for that purpose. So go ahead and begin. Kind of hear that people are maybe approaching it, so maybe 3 more minutes, then we can move on.
Right about a minute and then we'll wrap up.
All right, cool. We can stop. You can take that story, save it somewhere, set it aside. We'll revisit it a little bit later, but set that to the side a little bit. And thank you for indulging me in that practice. I know you probably didn't expect coming in here and having to do a free write or something to that effect, but I'm hoping that the reflective process was useful for something, and I hope that it helps set a foundation for later. That was my timer. So when I think about research and when I start to think about the way that I want to approach my work, I'm always brought back to this quote from a book that I had the opportunity to read in the last 2 years. It's called Homegoing by author Yagiyasi. And it's a really interesting book, and it's an examination of sort of the historical ramifications of the Atlantic slave trade. And it follows it hypothetically follows a set of families as they transition through that period in time to current day and things like that. And one quote that always stuck with me out of that was from an individual named Ya, who was a history teacher. So he says, so when you study history, you must always ask yourself, whose story am I missing? Whose voice was suppressed so this voice could come forth? And once you figured it out, you must find that story too. That stuck with me because I was in the middle of thinking about my dissertation and thinking about the voices I wanted to represent through my work. And I was struck by this idea of suppression and this idea of the responsibility of bringing those voices out, which made me think about, the narratives and things that I wanted to portray through research. So how exactly did I arrive at narratives and research? It came about when I was working with my research advisor at Michigan State University and trying to figure out the writing around my first 3 chapters of my dissertation. And in that process, I was struggling with writing some language explaining what brought me to the work, right? It was very technical, it was very mechanical, and I was trying to, adhere to all of the conventions of scholarly work in explaining this thing, and that it came down to not having a lot of soul or a lot of connection to what I wanted to do, right? So my advisor stopped me one time and was like, look, I know you're trying really hard at this, but it's not really coming across in the way that we want it to. Why don't you try something else? And at that time, she had learned that in my free time, I like to write short stories, right? It's something that I've always liked doing. I like imagining worlds, writing short stories, things like that. So she asked me, what if you, instead of trying to fit it within a particular type of language, what if you wrote stories that reflected the experiences that are bringing you to the work? I couldn't just stop there though, because then I started looking into narrative inquiry and using storytelling as a part of research, right? And while it was an interesting field, it wasn't something I think I had the capacity to fully engage with in my dissertation. But there were methods that were extremely helpful in developing how I thought and approached research work. So narrative and research. To me, it came down to the fact that research is about narratives and stories, right? As a researcher, you are a storyteller. Quantitatively, the story is being told through our interpretation of numerical data, right? Regardless of how you think or the way that you approach those paradigms, at the end of the day, you're constructing some sort of narrative with the data that you have available to make some form of argumentation, right? Qualitatively, we're doing this through text. And it's much more fleshed out, this narrative idea in research through qualitative research. So we see things in narrative inquiry, right? This is a type of research that's focused on stories, focused on experience, using life story interviews, oral histories, photo voice, and other types of methods to really get at the idea of human experience, right? And the purpose of this is to invite readers into a sphere of possible contact with a developing, incomplete, and evolving situation, allowing them to rethink and reevaluate their own views, prejudices, and experiences, right? It's a very reflective process that tries to connect with the reader with human experience and allows to see how our realities can be impacted by other realities or are shaped by different contexts and experiences, right? Polkinghorne talks about this in 2 forms. There's either the paradigmatic analysis, which is looking for common themes across stories. And there's a narrative analytic process, which uses data points from research to construct a story. And that second process is more participatory in that when you have your data points, you're supposed to consult with members of the community to see if the story that you're constructing accurately represents what's going on. So I had this dissertation project. Some of you know because you were in my job talk, but some may not. So I'll just do a brief rundown that I did a qualitative in-depth phenomenological study for my dissertation. I looked at one district, the Detroit Community Public School District. And I looked at 3 elementary to middle schools in that area. There are 7 participants. And of those participants, I did 3 interviews with the school principals. These interviews were structured using Seidman's 3 interview structure, where the first interview focuses on life story. The second interview focuses on the retelling of a specific phenomenon. And the third interview focuses on a reflection of that phenomenon. And it's supposed to be a way of understanding and getting a comprehensive look at the way that actors are making meaning in various contexts, whether it be through social context, political, all of those different things, right? So that was 13 total interviews. My analytic process included journaling and creating memos after each interview and observation. Then I transcribed interviews and created my themes and codes, which were then sent to my school leaders for review. One, because I wanted them to have the opportunity to participate in the creation of the follow-up interviews. And I wanted to make sure that whatever was being said and interpreted from their work was accurately representing the ideas that they were pushing for and things like that. And at the end of the formal interview process, I had the school leaders write or dictate a story, both from the material, but also answering a prompt within the type of phenomenon that I was interested in. And this phenomenon specifically was, how are school leaders creating community partnerships with nonprofit or community organizations, right? Then I used my journal entries to write reflective stories to try and capture my own meaning-making process as a researcher entering this context and where a lot of things were coming from. And my frameworks for critical race theory, school leader sense-making, humanizing research, and I even leaned on a little bit of Black feminist thought in the way that I constructed some of the things. And that's expressed here through a quote from Patricia Hill Collins, which says, the approach suggested by the experience of outsiders within is one where intellectuals learn to trust their own personal and cultural biographies as significant sources of knowledge, in contrast to approaches that require submerging these dimensions of self in the process of becoming an allegedly unbiased, objective social scientist. Outsiders will then bring these ways of knowing back into the research process. And that was what I was trying to accomplish with the idea of these reflective stories, right? I wasn't somebody going into the school space looking to understand a problem and just looking to, just observe and passively understand a problem, but I was somebody who was very involved through education processes, through my life experience, that colored the way that I was viewing and interpreting different things going into the school space. So I have some of the reflective stories that are present in my dissertation here, and I'm going to read a couple of them to you. So, just listen to my voice, hear the story. It's not the greatest prose, but it was really helpful for helping understanding how I was approaching this process. So to set this up, the first one is a story that comes from my time as a City Year Corps member. City Year is an organization that puts volunteers in schools to work with underperforming students in underprivileged areas. And I did that. I worked in that role for 1 year following undergrad. And that also became the organizational topic of my study for my dissertation. I looked at how City Year was operationalized in these spaces and stuff. There's a stillness as I drove that morning. It was 6:30 a.m. and the streets and the sky were still dark. A reminder of the recently changed time. Contrary to my usual morning treks to school, I wasn't playing the radio because I was too tired to turn it on. During the morning circle with my staff and the other volunteers, the air had tiredness sinking all around us. The day before, we were at the school until 8 p.m. preparing for the school's spring pep rally. And today we were holding an event, Pi Day. None of us were looking forward to it because of the problems in our individual classrooms. For me personally, it was tough because my partner teacher had taken an unexpected sabbatical and I was co-teaching the class with a long-term substitute. I was one of 3 on my staff who were put in similar positions. We all had classes of 30+ students that we had to manage with no formal training in teaching or classroom management, but our organization had taught us enough to survive. That afternoon was loaded, a pep rally at noon, tutoring session immediately after school, meeting with administrative staff, and then after that, Pi Day that evening. After a long day of dealing with students imbued with a variety of teenage energies and classes, the last thing we wanted to do was deal with whole school events, but it was a part of the job. The pep rally came and went with much fanfare and excitement, and with monetary support from our organization and help from the community, we put on a fun event for the students. One event down, many more to go. During the after-school tutoring, I made a math breakthrough with one student from my classes. He had been trying for months to understand negative numbers, and after enough careful explanations, diagrams, and practice examples, he got it and could get through a homework assignment unassisted. He beamed at me with pride when he said, "We did it, G." The students called me Mr. G or just G when the Mr. became too cumbersome. I didn't mind either way. His expression changed a little though, and after a passing thought, I asked, "What's the matter?" "Mr. G, you aren't going to be here next year, and I might get stuck with a whack volunteer." The student continued, "It's just every year they send a new team of y'all, the core members, and we have to go through connecting with you and learning about you, and sometimes these new volunteers suck, and sometimes they're great, but all the times y'all wind up leaving after a year." And that part struck me. Also, some of y'all don't get us, as he suddenly glanced over to one of my white coworkers who hadn't adjusted to the environment or the students yet. Following our tutoring session, we met the principal and his administrative team because he wanted to check in after the pep rally to see how preparations for Pi Day were going. We talked about the money we raised, the food and prizes we gained, and the events and activities we had scheduled for Pi Day, which was meant to be a family engagement event. We'd even gotten a community eyewear company to come out and give free eye exams during the event. This impressed the principal, but he sensed the heavy weight of tiredness that hung over our staff. He offered an opportunity for real talk and told us to ask anything that were on our minds before the meeting was over. One of my teammates asked why we couldn't get replacement teachers, a question that lingered on all of our minds. The principal smiled and pulled out some budget documents. He explained that the district had recently had a shortage of paper and other supplies, and that the schools procured those things in bulk. Between this, the building repairs, the maintenance costs for programs, he showed us that he barely had the money for full-time staff members. He exclaimed, "I know I ask a lot of you with the rallies and the classes and the events, but y'all are my safety net." He continued, "Getting 10 bodies at this price is a bargain, and y'all helped me out in a lot of ways." His honesty was brutal but earnest. This principal always provided cutting honesty with a cheerful disposition, a trait I knew him for when he was the math coach back when I was a student at the same school. After the meeting, we had Pi Day. The students and parents came out and had a great time of learning and playing together. During our debrief, we talked about how great it was to see the students and how differently they interacted with their parents. The feeling of tiredness had diffused and no longer hung over us ominously. Our events were a success, and we also had a better understanding of how the principal approached our work. Driving home, sky just as dark as when I drove in that morning, my mind remained fixated on that student I worked with in tutoring. I knew we had success together, but his comments made me question the value of my presence at the school. The second story comes from my very first interview for the dissertation. So that was my time at City Year. This is my first interview. I felt a well of excitement as I approached the neighborhood that frigid spring morning. Equipped with my notebooks and my recorder, I was prepared to have my first interview for my dissertation. I parked near the school and took a walk around the neighborhood. The fresh white snow from the previous night crunched loudly under my boots. I noticed that even though it was around the time for school to open, there weren't a lot of students walking to school. The houses that surrounded the school were large and diverse in shape, spaced in neat rows, but some were abandoned and carried vestiges of a forgotten past. I noticed that there were churches and liquor stores that surrounded the community, a scene reminiscent of my own upbringing in Miami Gardens. This helped me understand the situation I was walking to, a place possibly fraught with neglect and other things. As I approached the school, I noticed two buildings separated by a large athletic field. One was empty, and the other had cars around it, which I surmised meant that was the school building. As I entered the building, I could not help but notice the architecture. The hallways were massive and tall with classical touches. It looked like I was in a museum. On the walls, there are various fixtures, ancient Greek molds, gargoyles, and statuesque figures. At the main entrance, there is a metal detector and a security guard. The guard seemed skeptical at first, but once I opened up, once I shared while I was in the building, he opened up. "Oh, you're here to see Dr. Ellis? She's a special and busy lady. She gave me a shot. I needed a job. She needed more staff. I was dropping off my son for football practice and on my way to an interview when she stopped me and asked if I can handle security work. She hired me on the spot." He then called her on her walkie-talkie and pointed me to the office. I sat and had small talk with her staff. She walked in, asked who I was, and then offered to show me around the school. Before she could leave the office, a problem arose. Some 8th graders were supposed to go on a field trip, and the bus company was claiming that they never received the check, a scenario that seemed all too familiar to me. In a flash, she called the company, whipped out a logbook, read off the details of the check provided by the district, and the problem was solved in less than 3 minutes. Just as efficiently as that scenario had ended, we began our tour of the building. And as we walked through the halls, she was constantly stopped by students who she was able to directly name and refer to some issue or problem or something that they had worked through together. She took me through the entire building, even though the building was old, there was a lot of care put into the posters and flyers around the building. For instance, one hallway was completely dedicated to Black girl hair and Black girl magic. When we finally got to her office, we sat and began this interview, but then she was called for another incident. Once again, that logbook made an appearance, and within seconds, it was provided, the information was provided, and the problem was solved. With her continued demonstrations of efficiency, I felt obligated to stick to a tight schedule with my interview. Over the course of the interview, I came to understand Dr. Ellis a little more clearly. She was someone who cared deeply about her students, but was also in a position of needing progress and test scores. I was able to relate to her, drawing on my experience as a core member, since she was familiar with the organization I worked in. While she did not glowingly endorse the program, she did suggest that their value was in the number of caring adults that were able to be provided for the students. She also described the community around her school as troubled and the parents and families as needy. I don't know why those phrases didn't sit well with me, as I could see that the community had familiar markers of resource constraint. She also struggled to name the positive aspects of the community surrounding the school. But despite this, her care and passion for students were clear, and all her efforts were to provide for the students. She really focused on her initiative to provide clothes, food, and hygiene products to students, and she saw those things as paramount to in-school participation. As I left the building, I took more note of the surrounding area. I too wondered what assets could exist in a space that has suffered from historical neglect. The school and its students reminded me so much of home, and how after my time as a core member, I was left with some of the same questions. Academically, I knew that there were hope-centered and asset-based answers, but in the moment, my attention was given to the hodgepodge collection of houses surrounding the vast field of cloud-like snow. So why did I go through all this with the stories, right? Because those stories were a long-winded way of me approaching the way that I was thinking about the research process. In those stories was contained notions of methodology, axiology, ontology, and epistemology, right? The methodology was, I knew we had success together, but his comments made me question the value of my presence at that school, right? My interaction with the student I was working with left me with questions about how students were experiencing their work with outside volunteers, right? So methodologically, I knew I had to explore that through some sort of qualitative method if I really wanted to understand the way that students perceived and understood the work of these organizations. Axiologically, I noticed that I focused on this thing. We did it, G, and this other conversation about the teams of students being sent. And I realized that I valued the students' individual success, but I also valued their response to our leaving, that leaving and going process, and what it meant for that student to have to relearn another individual, have to re-interact with someone else, open up to someone else just for the purpose of them leaving again. Ontologically, what was the reality, both in my experience and in the experience in talking to Dr. Ellis, was that the schools that we were working in existed in a space of resource constraint, right? Existed in a space where they're working off of minimal budgets and trying to work their way through different things. And epistemologically, my way of knowing was centered on my own experience as a core member, and the way I was reminiscing and thinking about the community and reflecting on it as I was entering to the school space. There are things that were familiar to me that anchored me to the questions I was asking and to the way that I was approaching the research. Ultimately, all of this is about the idea of positionality, right? Articulating my stories in that way helped me realize the things that were really, really important in the way that I was going through this work, right? I'm a Black male, and I was entering a school that was predominantly Black students. I was a former core member and educator, and I was entering a space where I was interested in students' interactions with core members and education proper. Lived and worked in a community with resource constraint. I came from an educationally privileged background, both after city year, I was someone with a college degree, and then going into these spaces, I had someone who was privileged enough to earn a master's degree and be pursuing a PhD. But one really important thing that came out in my positionality, and I reflected on this in my statement from those stories, was I was viewing the community through a deficit lens, right? The way that I approached the community, especially at the end, looking around and saying, I don't know what type of assets are there, even though I know that there's literature that says we should be looking for assets in the community. I know that there's literature that says we should be moving away from damage-centered narratives of communities. But my feelings in the time were still being interpreted through a deficit lens and a deficit understanding of that community and stuff. And that was important to come out during the process of writing these stories, to understand that that's where I was operating from. And in some ways, the principal I worked with were also operating from some of those similar types of viewpoints about the community when she was saying that the families are needy and the community is in trouble and stuff like that, right? After articulating that, the rest of my research was a struggle with trying to figure out how am I wrestling with and reconciling with that deficit lens. Oops, too far there. So why positionality? The positionality that research brings to the work and the personal experience through which positionality is shaped may influence what researchers may bring to research, encounters, their choice of processes, and their interpretation of outcomes. So positionality is really important because it affects the totality of the research process, right? All of the data, no matter what it is interpreted and disseminated through some sort of social lens. And for me, this reflective process was helping me understand what was the lens I was bringing to this work. Even our department's land acknowledgement, which I read earlier, is an expression of positionality, right? We're understanding as a department that we all are implicated and are agents of an institution that historically has participated in colonial logics, right? So we say the land acknowledgement as a way of acknowledging that that history is true, and the hopes that the research that we produce is some way of reconciling with that history, right? The research that we're producing is a way of wrestling with the things that, colonial imperialistic spaces like universities may have to contend with. So I think it's a good step in acknowledging a positionality and in the hopes that the research that comes after is also aware of that. And I think that's why it's really positionality. We do it all the time in different spaces and stuff like that. And that reflective process really helped me wrestle with this idea of positionality. This is all related to a method called storying stories, which requires a researcher to reflect on their own relational, emotional, and intellectual responses to an interview. So that's why it was really important after every interview and after every observation for me to take note of not only what was said in the interview, but what was I feeling and thinking as I was in the space observing different things? What connections were I making in my own personal history that made particular things salient, more salient to me than other things, right? And that's all wrapped up in this process of being reflective, thinking about emotions, thinking about community, thinking about context and how all of those things relate to the research process. The second part of this talks about how going a deeper level of storying stories requires you to sit down with your participants and then engage in a process of effectively of member checking, right? You're sharing your research, you're sharing the data with the participants to one, make sure that you're appropriately representing their experiences, but also make sure that you're meaningfully incorporating those experiences in the context that they were meant to be shared in and stuff like that, while also reflecting on your own role, positionality, space that you occupy in the research process. So this process occurred throughout the process of my dissertation interviews. It wasn't something that I got to include with the dissertation because it became too long, but this is kind of how I approached it. After the interview process, I asked participants to share stories by the time that they partnered with the organization. I incorporated my personal thoughts and then sent it back to them. Then they added comments and edited the stories to represent what they valued or what they wanted to emphasize. And then I got to develop a meta story around the schools in Detroit, which findings were very similar to the things that I found when I did the regular coding process with my dissertation, right? That the Detroit schools were struggling with staffing, but this is rooted in a historical and social political context. Also, there's a history of community actors who contribute to the well-being of schools. The principals were leveraging this in their work. And then the Detroit principals managed to negotiate multiple partnerships to add monetary resources to their school buildings. And really importantly, the principals were race conscious and weren't allowing just anybody to interact with their students. They were very concerned with cultural responsiveness and making sure anyone who came into their school building was adequately prepared to work with their students and not cause harm. And all those things came across the stories that I had or interacted with the school. This last thing I'm going to get into is about an article that I had an opportunity to write that dealt with restorative practices in the Lansing School District. And that was another thing that relied on narrative approaches through my use of daily journaling. I got an IRB approved and interviewed select staff. I created informal groups with students. And I also had observations of student and staff interactions and staff interactions. So I got a chance to write a paper for the Journal of Cases that dealt with restorative practices. And I had all of these data components that I was just collecting and thought, oh, this would make an interesting paper. And decided to use a narrative approach. Right, and I have another story to share around that. But for the sake of time, I probably will, no, I'll just go through it. So this is called On the First Day with Facilitators. Titus Henry, Jamelia Sands, and Audrey Danvers were 3 facilitators selected by the Restorative Network, which was the organization, to work at Johnson High School. The 3 facilitators split 20 hours between them, with Titus working 4 hours on Monday and Wednesday, Jamelia working 4 hours on Tuesday and Thursday, and Audrey working 4 hours on Friday, mostly doing paperwork. At the beginning of the year, Principal Douglas sat and met with the 3 facilitators and discussed their schedules and her overall plans with the school year. She introduced the facilitators to the police officers, the SROs, and administrators, and other faculty. With all the pieces of the plan together, Principal Douglas was looking forward to the opening of the school year because this was her first time trying to implement a restorative practice program at her school. On day 1, the facilitators were being given a tour of the building by Principal Douglas. As they were coming down the staircase that led to the main office and the Serenity Center where they did their work, they saw a police officer yelling at 2 Black girls. The officer was a white male who did not work in the building, and he was bright red as he screamed at the girls, "You need to get out of the hallway right now." The 2 girls stood there, almost shrinking away, and one of them responded, "Why are you yelling at us?" The officer yelled at them again, "I've seen you 2 walking around these halls for 10 minutes. You better get to class, or I promise I will make this a bad day." One of the girls replied, "Can you stop sweating us? We're just trying to get to class." He chirped at them again and said, "If I see you 2 again, I'm taking you straight to the district in cuffs. That'll teach you a lesson." And after this, he let the girls leave. When Principal Douglas approached the officer to ask what led to the exchange, he said, "Those 2 girls looked like troublemakers, so I had to make sure they had to know who was in control around here." This exchange occurred in the hallway right outside of the Serenity Center. Jamelia was visibly shaken by the experience and asked the principal, who was that and why did he have a gun? And Principal Douglas explained that at high volume incident moments of the school year, police officers were stationed at the school for support. The problem was that unlike teachers, the SROs and the city police officers had very little training in restorative practices. Given the history of police interaction with the community surrounding Johnson High, police presence introduced an element of tension in the school at the beginning of the year. So that story or narrative came from a collection of my experiences being a restorative justice facilitator at a high school in Lansing, but also from interviews with students and conversations with faculty members there, where we worked together to kind of construct this narrative throughout that Journal of Cases piece and stuff like that. And again, it's just leaning on this idea of narrative methods to try and construct meaning, construct situations, and reflect the reality of the spaces that we were working in. So now I want you to pull your story back out, the story that you wrote earlier, and revisit it a little bit. What are some of the things that you chose to highlight? Have some of the things been incorporated to your current research approach? If your story elements aren't represented by your current work, why not and what changed? And can writing stories be useful in the self-reflection process? So revisit your stories a little bit, and anyone can, if you feel free to, you can share out, a little bit about your story and then how it relates to any, how it relates to any of these questions that are here. So I'll open the floor for that because I feel like I've been talking for a really long time. And anyone can just freely share. Any brave soul. In the online space too.
I think when I'm writing a story, the best part is that I can organize my thoughts. So they're sort of all messed up. But when I'm putting them down in words, I'm sort of asking myself those questions as I'm writing those words. And those questions are answered that, what is it that I'm going to put in my story that is going to take me to that ultimate question? For example, you had asked that, what brought us here, or why are we doing this research or whatever. So I'm able to question my own thoughts and put them in words, and so it sorts them out. I think the reflective process is a really highly meaningful and learning experience. So when I was writing my story, I chose those things which led me to answer that question that you had asked. And that is when I actually, ask myself those questions. They're there, but you actually answer them and you write them down. So I think it's a very meaningful, reflective process to write a story.
And I think, yeah, that's one of the major things with writing a story. Is like you just said, it's the ability to get organized and the ability to reflect on things that a lot of times we kind of get into spaces and we're working or going, but it could be good to stop, reflect, and think about metacognitively why you're doing what you're doing. So I think that's really, thank you for that comment. Does anyone else have any?
Yeah, I really want to thank you for sharing your research experience, because I can resonate a lot more. Was at the beginning when I wrote down, one experience that where I want to do my research, I find myself, so just to give a brief background, so I wanted to understand the transmission of intergenerational education inequality. I want to understand why, the children of farmers become farmers and migrant workers, that cycle of intergenerational migrant workers and farmers. But as I listened to your presentation, I started realizing that although implicitly I forgot to mention, what I really want to understand is their own stories, their voices, their choices, or not having a choice, how their own agency plays in this bigger intergenerational cycle. And then I'm starting also to realize that from the interviews I've done, it's like I'm, even by asking some of the questions, like, do you feel like you had enough educational resources while you were in school? Almost all of my participants are saying they feel like they have all they need, even if all they had was 2 textbooks from school. See, that was my lens. That was what I was trying to understand. Maybe you didn't have enough resources. Maybe the teachers weren't nice to you. So I find myself, that I think I need to go deeper in reflecting on how my positionality is, and influencing my analysis interpretation of the research.
Yeah, no, it really comes down to this idea of what and who we're trying to represent in the work that we're doing. And a lot of times we come with frameworks already sort of saying, I'm looking for this, or I'm going to find these specific things, and not allowing enough space for things to kind of organically rise and challenge the notions that we may already have. Anyone else want to share? Anybody from like the faculty side who you're a little removed from the earlier stages of research, but you're doing continuing research now?
When I do these sorts of things, I always find it interesting. I have a hard time writing my story, so I automatically move into researcher brain, and I'm summarizing thematically my experiences, I'm pulling out words and oh, I can think about this way, rather than sort of this narrative chronological reconstruction. I'm sort of oh, I'm categorizing those experiences and using words to sort of thematically categorize. So I find that these sort of exercises difficult for myself to really get deep into that reflective space, because I think I take shortcuts often.
Yeah, and that's something that I was struggling with when I mentioned earlier when I was working with my research advisor. I was struggling with that, right? I wanted to move immediately to sort of what are the themes, what are the major really important things, and the story writing process helped me kind of organize my thoughts and systematically work through the different things that led me to where I was at. So I totally resonate with that as well.
To follow up on Dr. Lawler's comment, sometimes I find myself writing those reflections, like my immediate feelings after the interviews. I wrote it down. I feel sorry. I feel like I'm using my participants because if they're showing me, telling me their emotions and feelings, but then I don't know. It's like when you talked about storing stories, it's part of the transcript, part analysis. And I don't know what to do with it. It's like, like in my analysis stage, I have my reflections, but then I upload them in vivo. I'm still coding my actual interview transcript, and I don't know what to do with my analysis. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. And I think the other thing that's wrapped up in all of this is it's very time consuming, right? Relying on your participants who you're working with for that feedback discussion can be very time consuming. And it ultimately affected, my ability to include those sort of things in the dissertation document. I still have them today and hope to publish and think about those later. But that time window was really, really important and can be difficult to maintain within a degree program.
I would also like to add, it's very interesting that with storytelling, the same story can have so many perspectives. And, as they say, beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. It's like the story lies in the hand of the writer. Because I think with the same event or the same story can change with the meaning that is represented in the story can change with the purpose and the audience. So I can have the same event, but just considering the audience or the purpose of that piece of writing, I can have a different kind of meaning come out of it.
Exactly. And particularly when we're doing work that's concerned with perception, right? It's really important to try to capture all of those dimensions because individuals' perceptions may be influenced with different things, right? When I first came out of my interview, I thought I was being really deep and really thoughtful. And then, like I said, at the end, I caught that deficit piece and said, oh yeah, this is the language that we've been taught in our classes and stuff like that to try to shy away from. Or these are critiques that we're taught to root within a historical context and not place on the community. So I found that process helped me find those things in my own work and start to try to challenge that as well. Okay, and then let's move towards our conclusion. So this all comes to the conclusion of how are research being used as stories, right? And just if I can boil it down as simply as possible, if you ever get stuck in the research, there are 4 simple questions that can help, right? 1, what is the story you're trying to tell? Or what's your overall plot? 2, what perspectives are you trying to highlight? Or who are your main characters? 3, how does your data fit into your story? Or what are your most salient or most impactful plot points? And 4, what's the tension? There has to be a main conflict. Stories, we all know that a good story contains some sort of conflict in it. And even if your research is exploratory and just saying, I want to represent this really good thing that's happening, there needs to be a discussion of, if this is a good thing, why isn't it happening as a standard, right? And that in itself can kind of be the tension or the conflict in speaking to the greater literature and stuff like that. So just opening the floor for any questions or discussion. If anyone has any questions, lasting questions, discussion points, things you want to brought up, maybe you want to share a story from before, throw it all out here.
Question. You talked about the meta story from the district schools. Maybe it's a very obvious question. I just don't quite understand the idea of the meta story. If you don't mind elaborating.
Yeah, so it was really from that, I think it was the narrative analytic process in narrative inquiry. That was where you take, no, it was from the pragmatic process, the paradigmatic process, my bad, where you're looking at multiple stories and looking for common themes across the stories to build sort of a story of the stories that are occurring and stuff like that, right? So moving from the individual stories and seeing, okay, through their lenses, through the ways that they're all bringing up the same points, what is the story of that district through their lens? And that sort of spoke to what was the story of the case I was bounding in, which was the 3 schools in that one district, who were all responding to a similar policy around the way they were expected to use community partnerships. So that really helped me lay that next to the work that I had already done when it came to coding and stuff like that, and seeing that it wasn't just that through the coding process, these things were emerging, but also like the story lined up with what I coded and kind of understood and stuff like that. So, yes.
Thank you so much. I wanted to underscore this story piece of, your description is in the context of a qualitative studies. But I think it's really important to understand this happens across all the research that we do, this idea of thinking about it as a story. And the first time that I heard this idea was in grad school when Tony Brake, who's the person who came up with HLM with a couple other very well-known quantitative researchers. That was his advice to his doctoral students was, what is the story you're telling in your dissertation? He was not my advisor, but when I heard that, I thought, oh, that's really, really compelling.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about a paper I'm working on right now with work that I have in the high school work I do in South Florida. And we have some findings that we're trying to make sense of. And these four different researchers are coming together to try to tell this story of how do we contextualize this quant data.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sent it to a journal and it got rejected.
Mm-hmm.
And then we sent it to another journal and it got rejected again. Just for all of you grad students who want to know how the process, So then we started saying, like, we have a problem here. Like, clearly this is not our, So the four of us got together and said, okay, what we need to do is we need to make this mixed methods. We need to contextualize it in the district context. And so now we have a new story. And the story is one of we scaled, this is what school leaders and educators say about the reform. Here's what these quantitative findings say. If you're a school leader, how do you make sense of this? Mm-hmm. And so it's just interesting I just have always found that idea of thinking of it as a story is very helpful. And I find it even helps me when I'm thinking about like transition words, mm-hmm. Like I'm trying to think, who's my audience is? How am I saying, using these transition words to my audience to help them understand what I'm trying to say. So.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I'm glad you said that, because that does, I tried to think about that and capture that, but I'm glad you gave that example. And it's also includes something that I didn't think about. It's also your audience, right? Like that should be in those bullet points there, talking about, when we are writing a story, when we are sharing a narrative, who is this for? And how careful are we with it? Because we all know, even with quant data, we all know that people can take statistics and kind of like create their own sort of misguided narratives, avoiding or even ignoring what was said in the actual analysis, right? So who is the audience, and how palatable is the audience, how meaningful is the audience, but also how are we explaining those things in a way that's compelling to the audience? And I think that's really important to consider as well.
So just two things. One, following up with Dr. Roller said, is sort of writing and reflecting with the stories, I think makes you a better writer. Like, it makes you more descriptive. It makes you think about words more intentionally, when even just the practice of storytelling and being reflective in that. The other side of it, when I was thinking about my own story, is like the triggers or trauma that can be raised with you as a researcher. So for example, I was reflecting on my racial battle fatigue study, right? And I'm sitting here asking students questions, and they're being reflective, and many of them is the first time or someone has ever asked them these questions about their experience. And then when I went back and like did my own memoing and journaling, I was like, hold up, no one has asked me. I haven't processed some of the racial trauma that I experienced as a student, and as they were sharing their experience, that was triggering for me, right? So then, like, I don't know if you have advice or thinking about, right, like the ways people can be triggered through reflection and through storytelling, or managing, trauma or other things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part, because like you're saying, with the one, you're like, nobody's ever asked me this. And two, it might bring up things where you're like, yeah, I haven't appropriately dealt with this thing yet. And I think for that, I would recommend a number of things, whether it be, finding someone to talk to, things like that, or just continuing the process of journaling to really, maybe that's a separate thing where you take the process of journaling and start to really unearth or uncover or discuss, like, what were some of the things that were bringing that up with you. And that could be a meaningful reflection, maybe not for like the direct research you're working on, but just to help you kind of process and work through those things and stuff. And if anyone else has any sort of good advice when it comes to stuff like that, or have thought about that, they're open to share that as well.
I have a question, actually more curious question, but I think somewhat related to Dr. Beatty's question on some level. I'm curious in your own life, kind of the role of storytelling. And was this transition, or was this experience in your dissertation and your research, does it have any connection to your earlier life with storytelling? And just curious more so than anything.
Yeah, I think for me, the storytelling and the way that I approached it and the way that I thought about the stories when I was analyzing this, working with the principals, thinking about my time as a city year core member, all brought me to this space of, I wish I was better for the students when I was a core member, right? I wish I had the same understanding that I did of educational systems by the time I was doing the project than back then. And it made me really think about all of the ways I may have perpetuated harm with students in terms of like, the ways that we taught, the type of materials that we use, the ways that I thought about, oh, let me connect to the students in different ways. And all of that came up through my process. All of that was like, wow, I thought I was doing a great job as like an educator with these students, but maybe there were some ways that I was reinforcing negative things with these students. And it really challenged me to be thoughtful in my work moving forward and stuff like that. But I did have moments where I was just like, oh, wow, I could have done that better. I could have handled this situation better. I wish I knew these sort of things when I was approaching the work, when I was in the school working with students. So, yeah. That certainly came up for sure.
Just to follow up, because to add an angle, when you were younger, was there, like, I think about me growing up and storytelling, I wasn't necessarily a storyteller, but I had so many people around me that were storytellers. And so I think it shapes how you hear and see things. I'm just kind of curious on that side.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was younger and thinking about the research made me think about my time in City Year, and thinking about my time in City Year made me think about my time as a student, right? Experiencing some of the things that I was reflecting on earlier, right? So, what did it mean to be in a school without like paper or like different things like that? And then thinking about the conversations around that, or the way that the adults around me approach that situation. And then thinking about the types of narratives that I carried as a student, right? When I was a student in the school that I was at, I thought the adults didn't care. The school really sucks. I would never want to go back to a place like this, right? Then 4 years later, I wind up going back to a place like that to work. And I had a better understanding of all the things, whether it be the community that were in the community historically, that were impacting. Well, at that time, it wasn't historically. It was just, I understood that things were occurring outside of the school that were influencing the school space. And even that viewpoint was limited and challenged once I moved forward. But for me, that process took me back to being a student in those type of schools and thinking about my position, my community, and the way I thought and constructed things as a kid going off to college, and then how I was constructing things going back into that space and having the opportunity to work with students who grew up where I grew up and stuff. So I think that whole process was this meta reflective process that brought me back through various stages of my life and made me think about, well, what is my story and how does that connect to who I want to be as a researcher, as a scholar, things like that.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
So thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I wanted to get your thoughts and experiences of doing member checking, because I feel that that's we use that, to improve the quality of our research, qualitative research, trustworthiness, and all of that. But it's a very complicated and kind of contested process. It's not as easy as going back to people and asking them, did you really mean that? Because people can mean different things at different points in time, depending on their mood, the context, all of that. But also, in addition to that, the interpretation of how we are interpreting what they said or the story that we are constructing around it, they might not agree with that. And And, you know, the four, I think, aspects that you talked about, that what is the story that I want to tell?
Mhm.
And whose voices do I want to privilege in, you use some terminology like that in that story. So based on my own experience, my previous research, which is in some way still ongoing, there were two groups of women that I focused on. One was the group of Pakistani American women who lived in the US, who were supporting these schools in Pakistan, and the other group were these Pakistani Muslim women living in rural areas in Pakistan who were working as teachers, you know, some of very few educated women in those villages. So I did do member checking with them. And the women in Pakistan were like, yeah, that's what I said, or it's okay, or they didn't have time, but the women here who had much more power and status and time, they did not agree. And it was basically the story that I was telling was that their schools they were doing really well in terms of providing the services to these marginalized rural communities, but they were using a very colonial class-based model of, you know, defining quality education in terms of learning how to speak English, or, you know, this very Western notions of what learning and teaching should look like. Whereas they agreed with me on that they were producing or providing high quality of education, they didn't agree with, you know, the whole politics around it. So I had to let go of that because I didn't write much about it extensively on them, on their life stories, because it was a very contested thing to talk about. So I wanted to ask you that, what do you think about member checking? Because I just think it's very hard to do, and especially when we're working with participants who are already, you know, have that privilege. They're the ones who challenge, and the ones who don't have that privilege often don't have the time or interest in kind of rereading everything and engaging with that. So what have your experience been like?
So my experience, particularly who I was interested in member checking with, were the principals. And this was working with principals during a time of COVID, where they're putting out, you know, 11 different flyers a day in their school by 10 a.m., right? So for many of them, it was difficult to, like you were saying, it was difficult to get them to sit down and have the time to go over this and stuff like that. But at the beginning stages of the project, I made sure before even interviewing to have sort of 3 or 4 informal relational conversations with the participants, right? To try and build up some kind of rapport, right? Whether it was phone conversations, we had Zoom conversations, just different conversations that didn't focus on any of the material, where we were just building rapport, right? And then from there, when I needed the member checking component, I kept, you know, just trying to ask them what works for your schedule. You know, I just need this amount of time for us to sit down and go over some things that I had already highlighted, and was like, could you clarify this? Could you speak more to this and stuff like that? And throughout that process, I found that when I set those, even though it may not have been as super organic as I wanted, when I set those type of parameters and said, I just want to explore this idea, this idea, this idea, this idea, they were willing to sit down and go through that, but only give me enough time for those ideas, right? And in some instances, I did have pushback on, you know, well, I didn't mean this in this way. And that allowed me opportunity to kind of ask, well, you know, expand a little more. Let's talk about it. I don't want to write anything that you're not comfortable with. How are you viewing this? Let's talk this through. And I think because of the process beforehand, they were amicable to that process, right? The only trade-off is I started collecting data in March of 2020, and I couldn't finish the analytic process because of this until, you know, I think it was close to, I want to say like October of the same year, going into trying to write. So it took so long to get what could be a seemingly little part, but it was really important for me to get that before moving forward with the work. So under different constraints, I don't know how I would have approached that if I didn't have a similar length of time to kind of approach that topic and work through that situation.
Thank you.
No problem.
Anybody else, either here today or in the at-home audience? The voice of God. which is-
Right. Come booming down. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Alonzo. This was great. I can't thank you enough for doing this. Research and your thought process went into all of this. Thank you all for coming today. We do this again in January, so look for an email at that point. And we will see you again for the next R3 event. Have a good day.